9 Comparative Method. Contents: 9.1 Introduction, 9.2 Relationship with Common Sense, Interrogating Ideological Location, 9.3 The Historical Context, 9.4 Elements of the Comparative Approach, 9.5 Conclusion. Learning Objectives. It is expected that after reading the Unit 6, you will be able to locate the significance of comparative approach with the context of the core issues of the objective versus or subjective, macro versus micro, and value neutrality versus partisanship. Identify a few lessons from your own research on social issues. 9.1 Introduction. Navigating the core issues of the objective versus subjective, macro versus micro, and value neutrality versus partisanship. Unit 9 refers to the relationship of comparative method with common sense and interrogate its ideological location. Next, as comparative method has its own distinct historical legacy and trajectory, the author has provided a discussion of the historical context within which the method emerged. The trajectory of the method is relevant to the way it is operationalized during the course of empirical research. Further, there is a systematic delineation of key features of the method. Throughout the unit, there has been a focus on the linkages between the overall theoretical assumptions, research methods, and field techniques. There is also a substantial reference to the social science research carried out in India on comparative method, and this will provide you with a solid base in applying comparative method in your own research, because as said earlier, there can be no sociology without comparisons. This unit will provide you with some identifiable lessons for your own research on social concerns. 9.2 Relationship with Common Sense, Interrogating Ideological Location. Students of sociology are well aware about both the distinction between common sense and sociology, as well as danger of collapsing sociological knowledge to common sense understanding. It is in the context of discussions on the comparative approach that this allusion to common sense again becomes important. You are well aware that we use comparison and contrast in everyday life, and it is no wonder that application of compare and contrast in the study of human society and culture is also equally common. If you think about your day-to-day understanding of social world around you, you will realize that you are involved in comparing and contrasting process. In addition, all of us keep evaluating things, people, food, cultures, etc., in terms of their inherent qualities being superior or inferior. It is quite commonplace to hear comments that our food is tastier than theirs, or that they have a more developed culture than ours. In the later statement, one detects an evolutionary assumption, meaning that there are stages of development and each successive stage is superior to preceding one. For long in sociology, it seems perfectly in order to compare the barbaric to the civilized or the primitive to the modern. Sociologists now more self-consciously use simple and complex societies to avoid the embedded value judgment that rests on an evolutionary comparative approach. Interestingly, however, there is also awareness even at the everyday level that comparisons are not nice, and we ought to value each person, objective or idea for itself. You would notice that some themes of the comparative approach also make their presence within everyday notions. Indeed, the connection and spilling over of the two levels make it doubly difficult to distinguish the sociological approach to comparison and our own lay approach. Whittle makes a careful and important distinctions between the lay comparative and sociological comparative approaches. While the extensive note to say automatic use of comparisons may be neutral to the process of human thought, the same cannot be said about the conscious search for a comparative method with definite or at least defined rules of procedure. Here one will find characteristic differences among the various disciplines that together make up the social sciences. Some disciplines such as economics and psychology have focused largely on universal structures and process common to human being anywhere, everywhere, and paid little attention to characteristic and persistent differences between societies. Others, such as history in particular, have dwelt much more on the specific features of given societies without venturing too far across their chosen boundaries in space and time. It comparative method as a tool of investigation designed consciously to discover the general features of all societies or cultures without losing sight of the distinctive features of each have been a particular obsession of sociology and socioanthropology. Emphasize mine. In his L.T. Hobhouse Memorial Trust Lecture 33, Vas Pritchard stressed the necessity of comparisons amendments that, in the widest sense, there is no other method. Comparison is, of course, one of the essential procedures of all sciences and one of the elementary processes of human thought. Evans Pichard was inquiring what Durkheim wrote. Comparative sociology is not a particular branch of sociology. It is a sociology itself, is so far as it ceases to be purely descriptive and aspires to account for fact. Macfarlane wrote that a number of observers have noted that in order to understand one phenomena, one must place it in perspective of or comparison to others, and quoted Louis, who put it thus: at the same time, a phenomena is understood only in relation to others. He little knows of England who only England knows. Hence, it is well to look at Western culture in perspective. Most sociological scientists are generally aware that they are involved in comparison all the time. As Macfarlane has put it, in the case of history, the comparisons are usually in time, in that of other social sciences, predominantly in space. The most familiar method of the historian is to take their own societies as the norm and then to see how far the past is similar or different from them. This is also what an anthropologist, sociologist, or economist tends to do in the dimension of space rather than time. Further, McFarlane has quoted Pocock, who commented informally, comparison is built into the method of the subject, for even in his first piece of field of work, the anthropologist is comparing the categories of his own society with those societies he studies. McFarlane has further quoted the Tocqueville's work, which illustrates such a method of comparison revealed in his memoirs. In my work on America, though I seldom mention France, I did not write a page without thinking of her and placing her as it were before me. And what I especially tried to draw out and to explain in the United States was not the whole condition of that foreign society, but the points in which it differs from our own or resembles on to it. It is always by noticing likenesses of contrasts that succeeded in giving an interesting and accurate description. As would be obvious to you by now, sociologists at different times have been aware about the problems of comparisons and value judgment. How did the classical sociological thinkers and the advocates of the comparative approach like Durkheim and Weber negotiate this? How did they manage to resolve the conflict between their commitment to a value neutral sociology and a commitment to comparison in terms of an evolutionary progression that tacitly accepted that Western societies had reached the highest stage of evolution? We discuss this in next session, which is on the historical context of the comparative method in sociology. Before turning to next section, it is good to keep in mind that not only had classical sociologists succumbed to the appeal of comparative method, but such thinkers as Herodotus, Aristotle, Polybius, among the ancient scholars, and Bodin and Machiavelli from the Renaissance had also used it. You can also draw a long list of scholars who derived inspiration from classical sociologists' application of comparative approach and gained a rich understanding of different societies and cultures. Macfarlane has included in such a list the name of Perry Anderson, Bernard Barrow, Louis Dumont, Ernest Geller, Jack Goody, E.L. Jones, David Landers, and William McNeil. Contemporary sociologists, for example, Andre Bettel, would make a case for continuing the application of the comparative method through with due care to avoid the mistakes made by its initial practitioners. This point of view has a lesson for you to look at the method with considerable caution and possibilities of entering into a debate about various ways of using the method. 9.3 Historical context. Although ancient and medieval scholars made use of comparisons in their writings, the comparative method as a designated method of social research was a product of 19th century sociology and social anthropology. In 19th century, the principal attractions of the comparative method came from the belief that it could be used for discovering scientific laws about human society and cultures. The strong advocates of comparative method believed in the possibility of natural science of society that would establish regulatories of coexistence and successions among the forms of social life by means of systematic comparisons. It must not be forgotten that in the 19th century, sociology and anthropology, the study of social and cultural phenomena, was typically combined with the study of physical and biological aspects of human life. The early sociologists, namely Emile Durkheim in France, Herbert Spencer in England, and Max Weber in Germany, considered comparison to be one of the basic processes of the way human beings think. Both Spencer, see Chapter 2 of the first volume of Principles of Sociology, published between 1876 and 1896, and Durkheim, see the chapters of 5 and 6 of the Rules of Social Methods, published in 1895, were greatly influenced by the organic analogy. Durkheim, in particular, developed a methodological use of the organic analogy in formulating a comparative approach to understanding the social world. Durkheim's systematic use of comparative method gave us impetus to its wide application in sociology and social anthropology during the first half of the 20th century. You can mention the name of Radcliffe, Brown, and all other associates as followers of these valuable methods in their researches in different parts of the world. Box number 9.5 A critical look at the comparative method. Undoubtedly, sociologists and anthropologists are able to reap a rich harvest of scholarly monograph comparing and contrasting the relationship between the structure and social practices. Most of the social research add a particular conception of society. They view this view have held in society as really sui generis, and one could observe it from outside and describe the same objectivity. Ingold has questioned the utility of this concept of society and held its uncritical use responsible for the failure of the comparative method to achieve the expectations raised by its extensive application. Max Weber's approach to comparative method took a different route because he was not at all sympathetic to viewing the sociological inquiry ending with the exploration of causes and functions of social phenomena. Weber was more concerned with the meaning. To quote Weber, we can accomplish something which is never attainable than natural sciences, namely the subjective understanding of the competent individuals. Not only was the early use of the comparative method tied to the idea of natural science of society, it was more specifically tied to the theory of evolution. A large part of the 19th century of anthropology was concerned with the origins of social phenomena and the reconstructions of the stages through which they had evolved from their most simple to their most complex forms. Bentley, commenting on the tension between a value neutral and objective approach and the influence of an evolutionary approach of early sociologists such as Herbert Spencer, Emily Durkheim, and Max Weber, remarks, they believed that society, culture, religion, family, marriage, and so on gave a shape to human life everywhere and called for serious intellectual attentions not only at home but also abroad. In this sense, comparative methods required in its practitioners a certain detachment from their own society and culture that was not required of the practitioners of a historical method. Many of the later had been ardent nationalists, since the comparative methods does not admit, at least in principle or privileged exceptions, it cannot as easily or as an openly accommodate the spirit of nationalism. The pioneers of the comparative method is in sociology and social anthropology were all influenced to a greater or a lesser extent by the theory of evolution. Indeed, it was the search for the stages of evolution that largely shaped the comparative method of Spencer and Morgan. These imposed certain limits on the extent to which they did in fact assign equally value to all societies and culture. It was tacitly accepted that the Western societies had reached the highest stage of evolution and that all other societies should at the graduated distances between below them. There were hardly any voice outside the Western to challenge these settled opinions. A gulf existed from the very beginning between the aspirations of the comparative method and its achievements. As you will find in Units 10 and 11, both the feminist and participatory approaches, in a very fundamental manner, unsettle the assumption of value neutrality and argue instead that the perceptions of the dominant section are passed off as the universal and neutral law. For instance, the perceptions of a privileged white male scholars of the 19th century could unquestionably pass off a universal knowledge. In that sense, the genesis of the comparative approach is very different from the feminist and the participatory approaches, whose influences in social science research are more recent and whose positions by survive the idea of value neutrality are also very different. Not surprisingly, the questions that have been raised by the feminist and participatory approaches have influenced in much deeper way the disciplines of the sociology and socioanthropology, the main practitioners of the comparative method. To came back to what Bentley they remarked about Weber and Durkheim. They were aware that the viewpoints might vary according to class or political affirmation, but they did not take much account of various variations due to differences of national tradition. They took the ideas and values in no Western societies into account, but only as object of investigations and not as an element in constructions of method. This has become a source of some anxiety to the scholars from Asian and American countries. The important questions that Bentley then raises is whether these limitations can be remedied by recommending different methods of observation, descriptions, and comparison to persons rooted in different geographical location. The answer probably is no. However, the sociologists, by explicitly stating their locations, national, ethnic, gender, even theoretical predilections, as the start of the respective studies would also promote methodological rigor for the reader would be in a position to critically examine the internal coherence of sociology studies as well as the dominant assumptions upon which they rest. At another level, that is the level of the number of nature of comparison, it has been suggested that we avoid binary thinking and do not employ a dynamic mode of analysis, comparing a pair, for example England and India or the West, and the rest may inevitably imply one of the pair to the better, superior, higher than the other. Macfarlane refers to Bourquet's comments on feudalism as an ideal type. There is a tendency to see French feudalism as the proper form of all other forms of feudalism and deviation. Bourquet has questioned these assumptions and observed that this is the case because the Western scholars had articulated most concepts in sociology on the basis of reflections of their own societies. Macfarlane has made a case for a three-way comparison. Box 9.2, Macfarlane's suggestions of a three-way comparison. Macfarlane has recommended an explicit three-way comparison of actual concrete historical cases, but they are set against the backcloth of Western ideals, which alone made the comparison possible. By extending the triadic method of two cases and an ideal type to the more complex one of the least three cases and an ideal type, we move a long way from those problems and relativism and essentially which have plagued much social sciences for more than 150 years. We can move towards a position where we simultaneously stress the similarities of peoples and rejoice in their uniqueness and differences. Let us at this stage in our discussions of comparative approach complete reflection and action 9.1 in order to fully grasp the issues involved in understanding the significance and at the same time in problem of applying comparative approach to our study of the social world. Reflection and action 9.1. Consider the following examples and answer the questions related to them. For example, Sir Henry Maine contrasted India and Europe. Marx made comparison among the various modes of production. Max Weber compared Protestants with Catholics within Europe and also contrasted Europe with religions like Islam, Hinduism, and Confucianism. Questions. What is the single element that stands out of as foremost in the above contrast and comparisons? Are the above instances primarily of contrast or comparisons? Are such contrast examples of binary oppositions? In order to avoid the comparisons various societies with huge gaps, as for example Europe and India, it is better to compare England and Japan. Identify the points of similarities and differences between England and Japan. 9.4 Elements of comparative approach. Elements of the comparative approach. Notwithstanding the critical remarks in the previous sections of the problems of negotiating between comparisons and the rule of no value judgment, the comparative method has been used in sociology as a matter of its natural practices. To state some of the features in schematic fashion, we find the following characteristic in the comparative method. Belief in the possibility of a natural science of society, the goal of detachment and uneasy link with the theory of evolution, influences of organic analogy, the intentions to have systematic comparisons. The sociologists have argued over the first three characters. They have remained by and large faithfully to the intent of having systematic comparison. For this reason, it is necessary to look at the following elements of methods, namely method of comparison, the unit of comparison, the purpose of comparative approach. Let us discuss each of these three elements at a length so that we can able to derive some useful tips for the application of the method in our own researches. Method of comparison. As McFarlane noted, comparisons can be undertaken in numerous ways, each appropriate to its task, and one cannot lay down in advance which will be the best. All one can do is to raise some of alternatives. So you may note that three types of approaches distinguished by Durkheim. We could consider a single society at a single time and analyze the broad variations in particular modes of actions or relationship occurring in that society. We could consider several societies of a general similar nature with the different certain modes of actions and relationships. More precisely, we would have here compare either different and perhaps contemporaneous societies or the same society at the different periods, if this inhibit some limited cultural change. We could compare several, perhaps numerous societies of widely different nature, yet sharing some identical feature of different periods, showing radical change in the life of same society. The units of comparison. Again, we refer you to McFarlane, who noted the success of comparative method will, of course, depend on the comparisons of things that can be compared. This consists of several features. One is that units compared are roughly of the same order of magnitude. For instance, it would not be particularly fruitful to compare the handshake in England with the family system in China. Next, McFarlane said, second, in order for comparisons to the effective things must be of the same class of or the order in some way. Just to compare, say, marriage in America with tea drinking in China would probably be fruitless. The selection of the comparisons is all important, yet even by choosing something that looks similar or one can be deceived. Words like city, marriage, family, law are notoriously loaded with ethnographic assumptions. Even such apparently obvious terms as house, meal, body carry complex sets of assumptions within each culture. Third, the purpose of the comparative approach. Social scientists consider the comparative method as just one of the many tools in their kit. It is essential for the user to consider why one is using a particular tool, what is the purpose, and how best to use it. In this regard, McFarlane suggests that it helps to a distance the over familiar, that is, familiarize the distant and make absence visible. Let us elaborate these points a little more. Distracting the overall familiar or turning the obvious into unobvious means to create a gap between oneself and the familiar things so that one can see them in a different light. Most researchers face the problem of not seeing what is familiar or familiar to one's own and hence self-evidently normal. Not touching the rim of a glass that has a water meant for drinking may not appear strange to us in India. You will notice again the concreted attempts even within the theoretical realm of sociology to questions of the common sense that taken for granted aspect of reality. Familiarizing the distance. Many of the things we encounter in our work are so unfair and distance that we cannot get inside their logic or understand them. This is equally problematic. The usual temptation is either to avoid the subject or altogether or to dismiss it as an irrational nonsense. Now the solutions may be known in a sort of way through the studies of others and in other societies. Examples would be the insights which anthropological studies of curious phenomena like the blood feud or witchcraft gave to historians studying the same phenomena in West. Making absences visible. The comparative method helps us to reveal absences. Always you will find that many interesting things are the absences, and it is not easy to be aware of this. McFarlane has given the example of Robert Smith, who recounts how a Japanese scholar replies when he was asked why ancestor worship persistent in modern Japan. That is now an interesting question. The real question is why it died and it's in the West. Of course, both are interesting questions, but the absence is certainly just as curious. At the end of this interesting section, let us complete Reflections and Actions 9.2. Reflections and Actions 9.2. Dumont has said that a solid and a true comparisons of values is possible only between two systems as wholeless. Basing yourself on this view of comparative method, giving at least 5 systems of social relations for carrying out a successful exercise of comparisons. How does the comparative approach help in familiarizing the distant? Burgess quoted the mathematician G. Polaya, who suggested that we ransack our memory for any similar problems of which the solution is known and try to solve the problem. Give examples of studies of curious phenomena which have helped the researchers to understand the problem in their own field. You may give examples from your everyday experiences of a similar type. See, what is the difference between contrast and comparison? Obviously, there are two different processes. Identify the differences with examples. 9.5 Conclusion. Dealing with the complex issues involved in the operations and comparing, we have taken an overview of the history of application of the comparative method. In addition to, we have also looked at the comparative method as one of the tools that social scientists use to give body to their explanations of social reality. Further reading. Betterly Adre 2002 sociologist essay of approach and method, and Andre Betley again the comparative method and the standpoint of the investigator. Even Pritchard, EE, the comparative method in social anthropology, LT Hobhouse Memorial Trust lecture. So this is the end of the chapter, unit 9. Thank you very much.